Hi guys, welcome back to Z's Corner. This is Al. So today's video is going to be about Lower Decks Part 2. And even though we're calling it Lower Decks Part 2, it's really actually about the mitigation equation. So if you recall, Lower Decks Part 1 was really all about damage and the damage, weapon damage, and how that's really calculated. So today we're kind of looking at the opposite of that, which is really mitigation. And if you recall from PvP in general, the two important elements of PvP is basically one, how much damage you're able to do, and then two, how you're mitigating incoming damage. So with both of these videos, we're really actually exploring in detail both the attack and the mitigation pieces of it, and how you should really crew your lower decks to kind of help support, your bridge crew, basically. So let's take a real quick at the overview. First off, we're going to look at the ship stats. We covered this in part 1 of the video already, so I'm going to try and go over that pretty quickly. 2 is going to be the mitigation equation, and unfortunately it's kind of different by ship class, so we'll actually spend a lot of time on this part of it. And as I kind of forewarned on some of my other videos, there's a lot of math involved in mitigations, so it's going to take a while to kind of explain. And then after that, we're going to look at some officer procs and then some examples. All right, so understanding ship stats is basically a review of what we kind of covered in part 1. Basically, your ship stats, when you get the percent bonuses for attack, defense, and health, each of them basically gives set bonuses. So attack, it gives you a set bonus to weapon damage. Defense gives you a set bonus to your primary mitigation stat, and it's based on ship class. So, based on if you have Explorer, Interceptor, or battleships. And then health is a set bonus to both hull and shield health. Now, before we kind of jump into the mitigation equation, let's talk about the base modifiers. And the base modifier, and this is kind of the reason why we have a few different mitigation equations, because base modifiers, these are kind of the constant values. They are different across ship classes. So when I talk about primary mitigation stat, that's kind of different by ship class. So for example, here for battleships, your primary mitigation statistic is basically your armor. Okay, and that's has a much heavier weighting in the overall equation, so it's at 0.55. And if we look at shield deflection for battleships, it's only 0.2. Dodge is only 0.2. And these are just constant modifiers, as we'll kind of look at just in the next slide on the equations. So if you add all these up together, it equals to be about 0.95. So for explorers, if we look at here, the primary mitigation then is shield deflection, as you would expect from an explorer. So it's 0.55 here. Interceptors, the primary mitigation is going to be dodge. So the weightage for the constant there is 0.55. And then we have what we call like our neutrals. And surveys are definitely neutral. And I think that defense platforms would be considered neutral as well. At least that's kind of how they're portrayed in the combat triangle graphic, if you look at it in game. So I think it's going to be considered neutral as well. So, the weightage here is 0.3, 0.3, and 0.3. And what you'll notice here is that actually, your survey and your other neutrals, their mitigation is not going to be as high as your warships. So this means that, in terms of theoretical maxes and mins, surveys are going to be at a little bit of a disadvantage. So what is the mitigation equation? Well, given these type of constants, let's look at it by class. And I think we'll look at battleships first. So I've got the mitigation equation on screen. It's kind of scary, and we'll kind of talk through each of this and how it's calculated. And as a quick note on this, I did not come up with the mitigation equation. This is something that Quirky Zombie did, and I kind of linked to his page. It's a little web-based application for doing the mitigation equation, and it's actually very useful. I used it quite a bit later on for some of the examples here. So you can check it out when you have some time. So basically, the mitigation here is then equal to 1 minus, and then parentheses, okay? So 1 minus, and this is the constants that we were just talking about at the page before. So for battleships, since its primary mitigation is going to be armor, its constant is 0.55, and I kind of highlighted it in red to kind of make it pop out a bit more. And then this constant is then multiplied by a function. So this is f of, a ratio. What the ratio really means, it's the sum of all your armor. So you basically have it gets more detailed, but basically you have your base armor, and then you have all the other modifiers that kind of influence the base armor. And this could be plus or minus or whatever. So, an example of the pluses would be basically your research, also any type of TC, territory captures or territory services that's affecting this armor. And then this is then divided by the sum of the armor piercing of the attacking ship. Okay, and the armor piercing then again is going to be affected by things like research as well as territory services and also officers and things like that. And I kind of forgot to mention officers here, but now that we have the new mitigation officers, their procs are going to be influenced in this number too. So you take the total sum of your armor divided by the total sum of the attacker's armor piercing, and you get a number here. It's going to be a fraction, or it could be a whole number depending on which one's bigger. And you plug this number then into basically this equation down here. And this equation is basically f of x. Basically, I'm just saying f of whatever mitigation stat or attack stat. And what this is, it's actually a curve. It's kind of like a logarithmic curve. So basically what it is, it's f of x is equal to 1 over parentheses 1 plus 4 to the, it's to a x, so to a 1.1 minus x, and this x right here, what this variable is actually this ratio. So if this was, if you had 100 armor and the opponent had 50 armor and piercing, then it would be 1 plus 4 times 1.1 minus, I guess I said 100, so my 1.1 minus 2, and this would be a certain number here. Okay, so basically this is the same thing. I mean, the shield deflection and the shield piercing is the same thing. It's the same f of x equation. It's the same overall mitigation curve. And you take this value, shield deflection, divided by the sum of shield piercing, and you plug it into this equation, and you get a value here. And then the same thing for dodge over accuracy. Okay, so it's always defense over accuracy in this type of or defense over attack in this type of equation. And then you multiply all three of these together, and you have a whole number 1 minus this number, and you get, let's say, a 0.78 or no, not 0.78, actually 0.65, and that means your total mitigation as a percentage then would be about 65%. So that was kind of a big mouthful. It looks very complicated, but actually it's not, and it's not too bad. If you really just kind of sit down and think about it. So I kind of put in a couple of tool tips here. People have always talked about this. So if you look at this, basically your theoretical maximum mitigation for battleships is 71.2, and your theoretical minimum mitigation then is 16.2. So how do you kind of come up with these numbers? Basically, for theoretical maximum mitigation, that means you have a heck of a lot more of your defensive stat than the attacker has in their attack stat. So if you think about it, basically as the sum of this armor or the sum of this shield deflection, and I just realized I spelled shield deflection wrong here, but some of this number or the sum of the dodge, if all three of these numbers are, let's say infinite, and they're really, really, really big. So what happens when you plug a really big x value into this function down here, right? So as this becomes really big, one minus a really big number is a really big negative number, okay? And then just so if you think about, limits and all that stuff, as you're going to infinity, then what is really this equation? This becomes basically 1. So this is 1, this is 1, this is 1. Then it's 1 minus 0.55, which is 0.45, times 0.8 times 0.8. And then that what that equals is I don't know, 18.2 or 18.8-ish. So 1 minus 18.8, then you get, oh, I said that wrong. Not 18.8. It was 28.8. So 1 minus 28.8 is basically this number. So this is your theoretical maximum mitigation. The best you will ever get is 71.2%. Okay, so then what happens when you have a really small number? How do you kind of figure out this theoretical minimum mitigation? Then you basically take, since this number down here, the attacking stat is so big, let's just say this is a really, really big number, this is a really, really small number, then this is equal to basically 0. So I guess the mathematical way of saying it is, the limit as x approaches infinity of the sum of armor piercing is a really big number. Then this entire equation becomes 0. And if this x is 0, then really what you're solving is 1 divided by 1 plus, 4 to the 1.1. So if you kind of do that math with these type of constants, the 0.55, 0.2, 0.2, I need to do, 1 minus that number and then multiply and all that stuff, and then 1 minus that number, then what you get is a theoretical minimum mitigation, which is 16.2%. So this is kind of what it'll be for actually all three, because it kind of ignores the constants on the warships, because no matter how you move it, it's still 0.55, 0.2, and 0.2. So if we look at the then mitigation equation for the next class of warships, which are explorers, which happen to be my favorite right now, it's the exact same thing. So you see the only thing that's been moved is 0.55 over here over the shield or deflection and over shield piercing. And gosh, I still spelled that wrong. That's kind of what happens when you cut and paste and all that stuff, or copy and paste actually. So whoops. Anyway, so if you look at this, it's the same as the battleship. But, in terms of practicality, what this really says is that, since your shield deflection is your primary mitigation stat, make sure you have the right officers to kind of keep that up. But also keep in mind, when you're attacking someone, basically the easiest way to hurt them is by reducing their primary mitigation. So that's why kind of since Marcus is all about shield piercing, right? So since Marcus is all about shield piercing, this is why Marcus works well against explorers, because he's lowering the primary mitigation value, since this is weighted so much more heavily than the 0.2 and 0.2 of armor and dodge in this case. So anyway, just keep in mind that you want kind of this ratio to be as small of a number as possible, which means you want to have as much shield piercing as possible when you're fighting explorers to lower their overall mitigation as much as possible. Of course, you'll run into certain barriers where it doesn't make sense for you to go even more on shield piercing. It might make sense to go more on the armor piercing or accuracy, depending on what those ratios look like. But as a general rule of thumb, this is kind of the rationale as to why, let's say, a Marcus or a Charvonic against battleships, or a Kane against interceptors, again, see the 0.55 here, of why he would actually work better, or why they would actually work better against certain ship types and stuff. So kind of keep in mind, it's because these constants that we had just gone over, that they change throughout the equations. So again, the interceptor equations basically the same, except the constant 0.55 has moved over to the dodge over accuracy function here. And then the only other thing I wanted to really add was that on surveys, really, I mean, they're all basically the same. So actually, it doesn't matter if you're using a Marcus, a Kang, or a Charvon against surveys. So that's kind of something to just kind of keep in mind. So next time you're OPC hunting against, miners, don't worry if it's Marcus or Kang or Charvonic. They should all technically perform the same, given if you have the same, officer stats on the lower decks. So again, because the sum of these constants here are actually a bit lower than the sum of the constants for the warships, you actually have different theoretical maximum minimums, and this is where surveys are a little bit not as good as the warships. You see that its theoretical maximum mitigation is only 65.7 versus 71.2 on the warships, and its theoretical minimum mitigation is 15.2 versus 16.2. So that's a percentage difference over there, and quite a few percent differences on the higher end as well. So surveys as a whole, and as designed and as they should be, I guess, are going to be weaker than warships. So basically, let's talk about the officers really quick in terms of mitigation. These were released with the last arc, with duality arc. So for interceptors, you have Martok. For the explorers, you have Gowron, and for battleships, you have Baal. So, again, Martok directly increases the amount of dodge that you can have. Explorers, for Gowron, it increases the shield deflection, and then for Baal, increases armor on battleships. So the counters of that, they've been with us for a long time. So Kang, increases accuracy. So Marcus increases shield piercing, and then Charvonic increases armor piercing. So these are the direct mitigations and what I'll call the direct counters to these guys. So before we jump into the examples for today, here are the questions that we really want to explore. So one, how counter officers reduce mitigations. This is pretty simple. How mitigation officers really restore mitigation. Again, pretty straightforward. 3, how necessary are counter officers when you're fighting with the combat triangle and the opponent does not have a mitigation officer on the bridge. Now, this is interesting. So let's say you've got an explorer and you're fighting an interceptor. Do I really need Kang to be on the bridge? Because, natively speaking, the explorers already have really high accuracy. So does the additional accuracy from Kang, is that really needed? Especially when the opponent doesn't have a Martok, the direct counter mitigation officer on the bridge. So that's something we'll explore as well. And the last question we're going to really look at is, in which cases would utilizing mitigation officers make sense to increase secondary mitigation for overall better total mitigation? This is something that Hugo has asked me to look at in the game. I haven't really had a chance because it's really hard to find people with max mitigation officers right now to really test it out in the game. So what we did was I built a few scenarios and we used Quirky Zombies calculator, basically his mitigation calculator, to kind of propose in which cases those could make sense. All right, so here are the examples. And again, I use Quirky Zombies mitigation calculator that's linked right here to kind of do all this stuff. So I took screenshots. It was kind of easier for me to kind of do the screenshots and then kind of paste it in here to kind of talk about it, as opposed to doing it live where I have to, type in a lot of numbers. It just kind of saves time since today's video is going to be pretty long anyway. So anyway, the first kind of example is really straightforward. How counter officers reduce mitigation. So if we look at an enterprise versus enterprise, I got my assumptions here right now. So all the officers are basically max. So the counter officer here in question is Marcus. He is max, 1600% bonus. Total officer stat for the officer ability proc is at 70,000. So this is what by this I mean when you're building out your lower decks with Marcus, you should be maxing defense. So if I max defense on my lower decks and my total ship officer defense is at 70,000, this is kind of what it looks like. So when you're attacking, then again, someone, and it's enterprise versus enterprise, so it's a very neutral type scenario. So you're attacking someone with basically high shield deflection anyway. So with Marcus, basically the math here is you take your shield piercing, which is 26,000 plus 16 times 70,000. And if you do that number, it should be this number, 1,146,000. The shield deflection here is basically all the defending stats here are exactly as they are shown to me on screen in the game on my maxed T9 Enterprise. And I do realize I have some research, so it might look different for you guys. But anyway, this is kind of what I'm seeing, and the numbers here is basically what I'm seeing in the game in terms of attack for base attack on my enterprise as well. So 24,000 armor piercing, 26,000 shield piercing, 334,000 accuracy. There is some rounding issues, so I can only show. I can only guess, what the numbers are here. So I'm putting 24,000 because I'm shown 24K in the game. And this could be 24,000 or it could be 24,999. But anyway, I kind of rounded down and just used the base numbers in all of this. The only weird thing is that on some of the defending values, so I mean on the thousands, they always show you. And then on the shield deflection, for whatever reason, it gets very accurate to the ones digits. So those are actual numbers these are all actual numbers that are in the game. So again, as I said, with Marcus here, basically he does shield piercing. So whereas before my base shield piercing without Marcus is only 26,000, with a max Marcus and with total lower deck stack defense and total ship defense at 70,000, my shield piercing is 1.146 million shield piercing. So in this case, my mitigation against my enemy's mitigation is then lowered down to 19.83%. Whereas if I just used a very generic crew, let's say a TOS Kirk, TOS O'Hara, and HG Warp, and I don't have a counter officer available to me, then its total mitigation is actually really high. It's at 58.9224%, because the only thing I've got going for me again is the accuracy, because the base accuracy on the Enterprise is high. The dodge here is very low. So again, if we recall those constants, that the multiplier here is only 0.2, whereas the multiplier here is 0.55. So this is why shield piercing, and you're using the correct counter officer against the correct ship's class, you actually can lower the overall mitigation. So, what this really means is that if I dealt 1 million damage without Marcus, 589,000 of it's going to be gone before it even hits the shields, right? And then if I hit it with Marcus, though, it only 198,000 of it's gone. So this is kind of why you really should have the right type of counter officers versus the right type of ship against the right type of ship class. So this is, again, a pretty straightforward example. So here, again, is exactly how it's kind of the same example as before, whereas we were looking at the counter officer, now we're looking at mitigation officer. So this screen, it's the exact same thing. So this is with Marcus, no Garon. If you have Marcus attacking, you have no Garon. Before we kind of talk about that, again, this is assuming max, right? So assuming a max Garon at 1400% bonus, it's a little bit less than what Marcus is at when it's maxed, but it's okay. But then the officer stat ability procs are the same for both at 70,000. So in this case, these numbers do not change because it's basically this with Marcus type scenario. So it's 19.8349% mitigation, so very low. However, if he's attacking with Marcus and you're defending and you add Garon on and you have the exact same, you can get to 70,000 health below Dex, because that's his proc health and not defense, actually. So if you can get to 70,000 health below Dex with Garon and he's attacking with Marcus, then you actually restore your mitigation. You don't restore it all the way up to where you have none, because again, his shield piercing is pretty high, and when you add into your own shield deflection with your officer proc, you're only a little bit above what his shield piercing stat is. So your mitigation is still only 32.992%. So it doesn't restore you back to what you would have been previously at 58.92%. But you still gain back, quite a bit. You still gain back about 13% of your mitigation, and this could make a huge difference. So now we're actually on to the third question. Are counter officers really necessary when fighting with the triangle? And we'll look at it with a few different ship classes. We'll look at the Augur, so the G3 epics first. So it's Augur versus Enterprise. So, if I'm attacking with Marcus, this is, assuming the Augur is doing the attacks and the Enterprise is doing the defense. And again, these numbers are from my own ship numbers, since I have an Augur and Enterprise both in the game. So they're with real numbers from the game. And the assumption here is basically, counter officer is max. So, all the officers are max, 1600% bonus. And then the officer ability procs are at 70,000. So, for defense here, I have 70,000 in this case. For attack here, which is the proc for Kane, I have 70,000 attack here. So, given these type of scenarios, if I'm attacking with Marcus, again, my shield piercing goes really high on my Augur because I actually have high shield piercing to begin with anyway. It's actually 308,000. And then with the ability of Marcus, so 16 times 70,000 plus 308,000, I get 1.428 million against the Enterprise with 220,000, 221,000, let's call it. Shield deflection. The mitigation, again, with Marcus is only at about 21%, 20.95% mitigation. If I tried to use a secondary stat as opposed to the primary counter officer, let's say, I went with accuracy, because why did I choose accuracy? Because it has pretty low dodge to begin with. It has higher armor than dodge, so I choose the one that's lowest here. If I use really high accuracy, I don't get really close. I get 27.33%. So I'm still about 6 point something percent, 6.3, 6.4% difference with this type of example. So in this case, probably not a good way, or probably not good to use Kane instead of Marcus. Now, so if we continue up the curve and we look at G5 ships, and I know it's not really applicable to most people, but let's just kind of do it for in theory. Okay, so in theory anyway, it's actually interesting. It's different. The story is different because if I use Kang to, in theory, with all this everything constant, I can get his mitigation down to 25.3. What is that? 3637%. Okay, but if I used Charvonic, why do I use Charvonic again? Because armor is his lowest attribute on his North Cut. Again, both of our ships are comparable. His North Cut is tier 4, mine is tier 4, my Corvus is tier 4. And our officer abilities are about 40,000 because we only have three lower deck slots. So anyway, so back to this. If I was hacking with the quote unquote correct counter officer, I can lower his mitigation to 25.37%. However, if I used an off counter officer, again Charvonic, because his base armor was the lowest, then again my armor piercing is increasing, right? I still have very high native accuracy anyway, significantly greater than what his dodge is. I can get to 24.3, what is that, 37%. So in this type of scenario, theoretically, I could do better with Charvonic. I could do about 1% better with Charvonic. Now, would I ever do this in game? I'm going to tell you right now, no, primarily because I get Hull Breach with King Captain, and that allows me to deal overall more damage and significantly more damage. So I'm not going to sacrifice Hull Breach and more damage for just 1% more of mitigation. So I wouldn't really use this in practice, but theoretically, I guess in the G5 world, sometimes it might make sense for you to consider using a different counter officer if they don't have mitigation on. The only reason this is going to hold true is because our base values are so much higher than compared to a G3 Epic or a G4 type ship. All right, so now we're on to our fourth question, and this question was, does maxing secondary mitigation officer make sense? Does this make sense? Now, basically, if you look at this, we're looking at Enterprise versus Augur. So the attacker is the Enterprise, the defender is the Augur. So you're going against if you're the attacker, at least you're going against the triangle, and both are tier 9. Again, the numbers are the same, 70,000 total max counter officers. And I think I forgot to put it, but I assumed also max, mitigation officer as well, and that's 1,400%. So anyway, if we look at that, if I'm attacking with Charvonic, so this is the quote unquote correct counter officer, and the opponent is mitigating with the correct mitigation officer, because Baal again increases armor. So we have basically they cancel each other out. In this case, his mitigation is 26.67%. So what happens if I switch it up? So if I kind of attack with Charvonic and he says, hey, I'm going to kind of rely on my base armor because my armor is high anyway. And let me rephrase that. If I'm a defender, I'm saying, I will take advantage of the combat triangle. I have a high base defending attribute that he's trying to counter with his counter officer. If I just kind of leave that alone and I max a secondary attribute, in this case, let's say shield deflection, because that was my weakest link before, and also because, Enterprises or Explorers in general have high accuracy anyway, so I don't want to increase dodge because I can't really get to a good ratio there, but I can get to a great ratio on my shield deflection. If I do that, then what can I bring up my mitigation? In this case, they're actually almost the same. Okay, so this is a little bit tiny better, like 0.3% better. This is not as good, but this actually opened up avenues when you're considering things, and it's saying if you're going in this case and you say, let's say I have a tier 4 or tier 5 Gowron, but I only have a tier 1 Baal, should I use Baal or Gowron? So in this case, you should be using Gowron, really, because he gives you more bonus and you can get overall higher mitigation, unless your Baal is the same as your Gowron, because you're fighting, again, you're defending. I guess if you're the defender, you're fighting with the triangle, so you're relying on your ship's base stats to kind of hold their own, and you're kind of increasing a secondary mitigation stat. And when is this really pronounced? This is really pronounced in the second example we're going to see right here. So in this case, you can see if let's say you're fighting a higher ops player and they have a much better officers than you. Let's say their total officer for their attacking proc is, let's say, 100,000. With lower deck stacked, that means they can do a significant amount of armor piercing. And if you have Baal, and this is assuming max Baal. If you don't even have max Baal, it would be even worse. Let's say even with max Baal, you can only get to 40,000 of the officer proc for Baal. That means your armor that you can increase is only going to go up a little bit, right? So I mean like 500,000 ish. But it's still a far cry from what this ratio needs to be. So your mitigation is only 23.3%. So what if you kind of change gears and say, hey, I'm going to forget about that because I'm so outclassed. Let's say I want to increase my shield deflection. So if I increase my shield deflection with Gowron, again, assuming 40,000 total officer proc for Gowron, I can increase it at a huge factor and I can get to 31.78% mitigation. So you can see this is significant. This is kind of what Hugo was asking me about before in previous videos. So when does it make sense? Well, Hugo, and then it makes sense in a few cases. It makes sense mainly, I guess, if you're defending with the triangle from the defender's perspective, and if your officers are basically outclassed. If that's the case, then if you're increasing your secondary mitigations, then you can have better overall mitigation than if you were trying to directly counter the counter officer in this case. And a quick note about some of these numbers. Basically, if we're looking at the secondary mitigation stats, as long as this number is 10 times greater than the attacker's number, then you're golden. You can't really go beyond the 10. 10 is kind of the magic number because of how the equation works. So this is why you would choose something where they have the lowest number here, because 10 times shield piercing, basically I only had to get to 260,000 here to see basically this number. Whereas if I had chosen, Martok with dodge, I would have had to get to, 10 times 334,000. I would have needed to get to 3.34 million. And that was not feasible, really. So in this type of scenario, it really only works when you're defending, and from a defender perspective, you're defending with the triangle. So here's another example of the same question, and this is being answered on G5 ships. So, if the Northcut was attacking my Corvus, if Baller was attacking my Corvus, and I was mitigating with Gowron, then, I could get to around 55% type of mitigation here. However, if I went with my secondary mitigation officer of Martok and just kind of increase my dodge, because again, his lowest stat here, if you're looking at it, is basically accuracy. So if I increase my dodge from a base of about 105,000, if I increase it with about 40,000 of the officer proc from Martok, then I can probably get to around 745,000 with a max Martok, okay? Then my overall mitigation actually increases. It goes from 54.87% to about 56.75%. So this is another example of where this works, and this is really because we have pretty high base stats, I guess. I guess in the future I might switch from using Gowron on my Corvus to using Martok. And this really only works when you're actually fighting, I guess, against or with the triangle from the defender's perspective. Because if you had, let's say I was fighting Enterprise A, I would not get a number this great, because even though he's increasing his shield piercing, the Enterprise A's accuracy would be really high here anyway. So I really can't get to a pretty good factor on my dodge to offset that. So for very specific case scenarios, I'd say it would work. But remember, when you're crewing for PvP, especially for takeovers, you're not just crewing against one opponent, you're crewing against multiple opponents. So would I really substitute, Martok for Gowron? Probably not, because I can see more broad usage against the Gowron. I can not only fight the Northcut, I can fight also Enterprise A's and things like that. So again, in a theoretical world, let's say if I was, in the game application, if I was defending against a base raid, and the opponent had only a north cut, and that was the only one I have to worry about, then maybe, yeah, it would make sense to kind of use Martok instead of a Gowron as my primary mitigation officer. So what are the implications? Well, basically for G3 and G4 ships, I always just use direct counter and direct mitigation officers. That's probably the easiest take on it. And for lower decks, kind of really focus on maxing those officers, the bonuses for those officers. When fighting higher ops players, however, it doesn't matter if you have G3 or G4 ships, it may be beneficial to use a secondary mitigation officer, especially when you're defending or I guess with the triangle, right? So if you're defending with the triangle, if we remember from those examples we just looked at, then sometimes the secondary mitigation officer would make sense. Now, for G5 ships, you can really consider using offset counter and offset mitigation officers. The only watch out is that, in real world scenarios, a lot of this kind of depends on the opponent's officer stats being equal or lower. If they actually have a higher officer stat on any one of their counter or mitigation type officers, then maybe this type of scenario wouldn't work, just because the percentage differences weren't that great. It was only like 1 or 2%. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video today. If you're not a subscriber, please hit the subscribe button and feel free to leave comments below. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.